The window of our bedroom caught the sunrise every single morning without fail. I remember this because I spent weeks memorizing the exact moment darkness began surrendering its hold on the glass. Those early weeks of carrying my first child, sleep abandoned me completely and left me watching. Not because dawn brought hope or warmth or anything resembling comfort to my exhausted body. Morning meant Amos would rise from beside me and walk toward the barn and his chores. For those few hours between breakfast and midday, my lungs could actually fill with air completely. I was 22 years old and 7 weeks along and already measuring my life in intervals. The space between his leaving and returning had become the only arithmetic that mattered to me. My name is Mary Yoder, and I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. 6 years ago, I walked away from everything I had ever known or been taught to love. This channel exists because I finally have permission to speak words that my community sealed shut. Behind the prayer cap, there are stories that never reach the outside world or its people. If you want to hear what plain life actually sounds like from the inside, subscribe now and stay. Hit the like button and leave me something in the comments below this video today. Were you raised inside a faith where a woman's body belonged to everyone except herself? I read every single comment because each one reminds me that silence is no longer required. Let me explain what Amish husbands are permitted to do with a pregnant wife's body. There are no rules written anywhere, and that absence functions as its own kind of permission. In the English world, pregnancy builds a kind of invisible fence around a woman for protection. People inquire about her comfort and remind the father to be tender and patient with her. Doctors explain what the body needs, and books describe what the body is actually going through. The woman becomes temporarily sacred in a way that considers her experience worthy of attention. In my community, pregnancy carried an entirely different meaning that had nothing to do with protection. It meant you had completed the one task that justified your existence within the order. The bishop said it from the bench without hesitation, and no one in the room flinched. A wife's body belongs first to her husband and then to God, in precisely that order. The child growing inside was evidence that both claims were being honored as intended by design. Pregnancy did not alter a single expectation placed upon you or your daily obligations to function. You kept the kitchen running and the floors swept and the garden weeded and the husband satisfied. The life assembling itself inside your womb was never a reason to slow down. It was a reason to express gratitude for your role and your place in creation. The Ordnung did not need to spell this out because everyone already breathed it like air. I married Amos when I was 20 and he was 26, with 200 acres. His reputation in the district was solid, and his hands had never known a single idle moment. He was not a man who asked whether something was too much for another person. He only asked whether the task had been completed or whether it still remained undone somewhere. Our courtship lasted 6 months of Sunday evening visits with his buggy parked at our lane. My mother's bread sat on the table between us like a third person observing everything. We discussed his plans for the back field and how many children God might eventually send. He said he hoped for many, and I agreed because I did not yet understand the contract. We married on a Thursday in late October, with 300 people watching us for hours. 4 hours on wooden benches while the bishop preached about yielding and surrender and the beauty therein. By December, I was pregnant, and the life I had agreed to began revealing its true dimensions. I need to be careful here, because years of therapy have taught me that precision matters more. Amos was not a violent man, and I want that stated clearly so you understand what follows. He never struck me, and he never raised his voice loud enough to make children startle. What he did was quieter than violence, and in many ways much harder to identify or name. The community had already given it a name, though, and that name was headship and natural order. In Old Order communities, a wife's submission to her husband is not a gentle suggestion or preference. It is doctrine woven into every interaction and expectation and glance exchanged between married people. The Ordnung does not provide a written list you can point to and say, "Here is proof." It lives in the air between women at quilting frolics when one arrives with trembling hands. It lives in what the older women do not say when you mention that you are tired. A wife does not refuse her husband, and that sentence never needs to be spoken aloud by anyone. Every girl absorbs it by watching her own mother move through the days without complaint. You learn it from the silence around the subject in church, which is its own curriculum. Silence in the Ordnung means the matter is settled and closed and beyond the reach of questioning. I was 7 weeks pregnant when a thought formed inside me that I could not name. It would take years, and a beige office in Columbus, Ohio, and a therapist with direct questions. The word she eventually gave me was coercion, and it landed like something I had always carried. But back then, in that farmhouse with the east-facing window, I had no such word. What I had instead was the understanding that this was simply what obedience looked like in practice, that questioning any part of it was identical to questioning God himself and his design, that a faithful wife endured, and a faithful wife did not ask why endurance was required of her. My friend Sarah married 2 years before me and had her first baby at 19. Her second came 14 months later, and she moved through both pregnancies like someone underwater. When I was newly pregnant, we sat together shelling beans on her back porch one afternoon. I told her I was exhausted in a way that went beyond the constant nausea or the aching. Something else lived behind my eyes that I could not describe with any words available to me. She looked at me for a long moment and then said quietly, "It gets easier after month 3. Not the tiredness," she said, "but the other thing." And then she looked back at her beans. She was not telling me it would improve, but that she had learned to stop noticing it. That understanding settled into my chest like a river stone dropped into still water without any splash. 16 seconds on a back porch while autumn light moved through the bean vines above our heads slowly. That was the most honest exchange any woman in my community offered me during those entire 8 months. Not even words, really, but the space between words, where truth lived without needing to announce itself. She was telling me that survival meant learning to disappear from your own body while remaining present in it. That the numbness was not a failure, but a skill passed between women like a recipe never written down. I carried that conversation home in my chest, beside the growing weight of the child and the silence. The knowledge that other women knew exactly what happened behind closed doors changed nothing, except my loneliness about it. I went to my mother once, and the going itself was an act that nearly broke me before I spoke. "You brought your mother a sick child, or a ruined crop, or a death that everyone could see and acknowledge openly. You did not bring her a marriage, because a marriage was not a problem, it was a covenant sealed before God." But I drove to her kitchen one October afternoon, with the fields going golden brown on both sides of the lane. I told her carefully that I was tired in a way that felt like something beyond pregnancy and its ordinary demands. Her hands never stopped working while I spoke, and the needle kept pulling thread through my father's torn shirt evenly. She said Amos was a good man who provided a warm house and food in the cellar and did not drink. She said God would give me strength if I asked with a humble heart, and then handed me the mending. That was the entire conversation. And I drove home understanding there was nowhere else to go with this weight. My mother was not cold, and I want that understood because she was the warmest presence in most of my memories. But the wall of marriage stood between us, and she could not see past it or would not choose to. Even now, 6 years later, I cannot determine which was true, and perhaps the distinction does not actually matter anymore. The 5th month was the one that nearly shattered whatever remained of me still holding its original shape together. Women at church noticed my growing belly and placed soft hands on my arm and asked about the baby. I smiled and said I hoped for a healthy child, and that was entirely true and entirely incomplete at once. I loved what grew inside me with a fierceness that frightened me, but I was barely sleeping anymore. The arithmetic I was doing every single day was not arithmetic Amos was doing, or perhaps chose not to do. What was being asked of a body that was building a person cell by cell while running a household completely, and also every night being required to remain available in the way doctrine demanded a wife remain available. The numbers never balanced, and they were never going to balance because the equation itself was designed to be unsolvable. I had no language for any of this, only a bone-deep exhaustion and that east-facing window every morning. I tried once to tell him gently, the way you might mention a loose wheel before the whole wagon collapses. I said I was very tired and the baby sat heavy and I had not slept properly in many weeks. He looked at me with something that was not cruelty, and I want to be precise about that distinction. It was the blankness of a man whose entire framework for marriage did not contain this particular variable anywhere. His wife's comfort was not a column in the ledger his father and bishop and community had handed him at birth. He said he understood and that I should rest more during the day, and then night continued as night continued. There was a woman I will call Ruth, who was in her 60s when I carried my first child that year. She had raised 7 children and buried one, and worked alongside her husband for 40 years on respected land. She carried a kind of authority that never needed to announce itself because everyone already recognized it without words. One afternoon in my 6th month, she came to help me put up the last of the applesauce for winter. We worked 3 hours side by side, and she talked about grandchildren and frost, and whether the new deacon would work. Easy talk that runs beneath the real conversation, the way water moves under ice without being seen from above. Then, without looking at me, she said, "The last months are always the hardest on a woman carrying her first." She said some women found it helped to spend those final weeks sleeping in the spare room, for practical reasons. The belly makes the bed crowded, she said, and sleep matters more than people acknowledge when a body is working. Her own mother had done it with her last 2 children, and her husband had understood that practical meant kindness. I kept my hands moving on the jars and did not look at her face, and she did not look at mine. What she gave me in that moment was more valuable than anything anyone offered during those entire 8 months of carrying. Not permission from any official source, because no official source existed for something like this in our world. She gave me the knowledge that other women had found a way to make space inside the silence without breaking it. That you could say with a spare room what you were never permitted to say with actual words spoken aloud. I moved into the spare room in my 7th month and told Amos it was the belly and the disrupted sleep. He accepted it the way he accepted most practical things, without enthusiasm, but without argument or visible anger about it. For 6 weeks, I slept in a way that felt like surfacing from deep water after being held under too long. I woke before dawn and lay listening to horses shifting in the barn and felt the baby turn beneath my hands. I thought about what kind of woman I would teach her to become if God sent me a daughter this time. What words I would place in her mouth that nobody had ever thought to place in mine when I was small. She was a girl, and we named her Hannah, and she came into the world already demanding to be heard. I left the community when Hannah was 2, and her brother Elias was 3 months old, and the shunning came immediately, complete and total and swift, like a door slamming shut on every face I had ever loved or turned to. My mother's phone rang unanswered, and then mine rang unanswered, and letters came back sealed and untouched by familiar hands. I found a therapist in Columbus, who was a small woman with reading glasses she kept losing on her desk. In our 3rd session, I described those 8 months in the only words I had, which were imprecise but honest. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment that stretched like a held breath. Then she said, "What you are describing has a name," and that sentence changed the architecture of my entire understanding. I had lived inside something for 8 months that my community deliberately kept nameless, because the absence of naming was the mechanism. If no word exists for a thing, then the thing itself cannot exist, and if it cannot exist, there is nothing to refuse. A wife who endures is simply faithful, and a husband who demands is simply a husband fulfilling his God-given role. Hannah is 8 now, and she asks questions constantly. And every single time she asks, I answer her fully and honestly, especially when I do not have the answer, because the willingness to say I do not know is its own kind of freedom. If you were raised in a place where your body was never considered yours, I see you standing there in that memory. You were working with what you had been given, and what you were given was never enough, and that was never your fault. The full version of this story lives in the Ordnung they never wrote down, linked in the first comment below this video.